Hi, so we're going to go over the UV mapping setup, the UV editor, and the UV tools interface just to get you started so we can start UV mapping. So the first thing I like to do is have a split screen. That's a perspective on one side so I can see my model, and then the UV maps on the other side. So what I'm going to do, I already have a preset, but if you don't, and I'm going to show you how to make one. Over here, you notice there's the outliner, but if I right-click on these little icons, which are showing me different views, I can actually add another one. And what I want to do is go two panes side by side, and I already have it set up, that's why it's doing that. But on the left, I would go and make sure it's perspective view, and on the right, I would make sure that it is the UV editor. So that's where you go to Panels, Panel, UV editor. The next thing I want to do is I want to set up and turn on my UV tools. So, show UV toolkit. And here it is here. Now sometimes when it pops up, it might be floating. And if it is, you just simply drag it over here, drop it in, and now we have it along with like the channel box, my modeling tools, and the other tools that I love putting over here. So we have the UV editor, the UV toolkit, and then the next thing we want to do is just set up some of these little keys and our custom shelf that's inside of the UV toolkit. So you'll notice I have my own custom shelf with some icons, which are buttons and functions that I use often. If I go over, we see we have a lot of different menus, and under View, I want to make sure that I've turned on my custom shelf. And when that's turned on, it'll have an empty spot. The thing to remember is when you put your cursor over different icons, it tells you what they are. And over here, I've put the ones that I love using a lot so I don't have to dig for them. I've got my flip UVs, my rotate UVs, this awesome new tool called the 3D Cut and Sew tool, which we'll be going over. The modify the UV layout, which creates a lattice, a deformer to actually manipulate UVs, get them nice and clean and adjusted. And then the separate the UVs, which is a nice quick way of just cutting some UVs when we're doing our shells. Here we have the basic tools, and once again you can always go over it, and if you look at the bottom left, you can see that besides the little pop-up, which is also giving me the shortcuts for how to get to the options of these, I can show the, so if I select an object, I can show the wireframe. I can show shaded mode, which tells me when there's UVs overlapping or they're flipped, and they'll show up as red if they're wrong. Distortion, where do we see the most distortion? Where do we see the least? UV borders, which is super important, where we see the white outlines around them. This toggles the coloring with the UV border edges. There's only one shape right now, so it's not really doing that much. The grid, and you'll notice that my 0 to 1 shape, which is this quarter right here, if I go to have an object selected and I go to textures, checker map, we can see that that is actually showing me my UV spaces. And what it does is if any of these areas are actually showing up, it means that I'm going to right click, go to UVs, grab my UVs and just scale them in just a little bit. It means it's bleeding out into those areas, because if I move the UVs, it's going to actually show those. But typically you want your UVs, except for in certain instances, to always be in the 0 to 1 space. display image. And that would be either the checkerboard or if I have a material with a texture assigned to it. We can see the checker map, which is what I've turned on so I can see distortion without even putting a texture. And it also makes sure that I can see that my textures are flowing the right way if I can read it and it's not in reverse. If I had textures, they'd be attached here. Do I want to see RGB mode or alpha? And this one's really nice because a lot of times this becomes really difficult for us to see the UVs over a texture or a grid. So when I turn this on, I can actually dim that texture pattern to make it a lot easier for me to see my UVs. A lot of these other ones we'll go over later, but for right now, these are the ones you need. And then I have my texture, my UV toolkit, excuse me, that has all of the little things that you will be going over. And the first thing we'll be going over is create when you're mapping the different types of maps that you can create. Now that I've got my little setup here, and you'll notice if I squeeze this too tight, some of these icons hide. But now that I have this, I want to keep this layout. So I would just right click, save the current layout, and then give it a name like Perspective UV Editor, hit OK, and then I can always go back in and you see I've already saved mine. So now I can actually go in and I'm able to create this UV Perspective UV Editor layout just by simply clicking on that in the future.